The Information Philosopher presents Robert Kane, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Texas in Austin, delivering a lecture on free will, new perspectives on an ancient problem.
My dealings with free will date back to the mid-1960s and are coterminous with a resurgence of interest among philosophers in problems about the freedom of the will that began in the decade of the 1960s. The landscape of the free will issue was very much simpler then. The unstated assumption was that if you had scientific leanings, you should be a compatibilist about free will, believing it to be compatible with determinism. That is, you should be a compatibilist if you did not deny we had free will altogether, as did skeptics and hard determinists. And if you were a libertarian about free will, believing in a free will that is incompatible with determinism, you must, in order to make sense of such a free will, inevitably appeal to uncaused causes, immaterial minds, noumenal selves, non-event causes, prime movers unmoved, and other examples of what P.F. Strawson called the panicky metaphysics of libertarianism in his influential 1962 essay, Freedom and Resentment. Now, I started thinking about free will shortly after Strawson's essay appeared, when my philosophical mentor at the time, Wilfrid Sellars, challenged me to reconcile a traditional incompatibilist or libertarian free will with modern science. Sellars was a compatibilist about free will, like the vast majority of philosophers and scientists of that era. And like Strawson, whose essay he admired, he did not believe a traditional libertarian free will could be accounted for without appealing to mysterious or obscure forms of agency of the kind Strawson had dubbed panicky metaphysics. Employing a well-known distinction that he had introduced in the philosophical literature, Sellars granted that free will in some sense was an integral part of what he called the manifest image of humans and their world. But he did not believe a libertarian free will, one that was incompatible with determinism, could be reconciled with the scientific image of that world, and he challenged me to show otherwise. I accepted the challenge, and I remember thinking, with the brashness and naivete of youth, give me 3 or 4 weeks and I'll wrap this up and be back with an answer, or at the outside by the end of the semester. Well, it's now 45 years later, and I'm still struggling with the challenge. When faced with the great problems of philosophy, we are like, quote, owls squinting at the sun, to use a phrase I once borrowed from Nicholas of Cusa, the medieval philosopher. But while squinting at the sun, I believe modest progress can be made on the great issues, and so it is with free will. The situation today is far more complex with respect to the relation of free will to science than 4 decades ago. And the question of whether libertarian accounts of free will can be reconciled with the scientific image of humans in the modern natural and human sciences without appealing to special or mysterious forms of agency is now at least a question that's debated rather than dismissed out of hand. One reason why the challenge was so much more difficult than I naively assumed back then was something I only gradually came to realize. To make sense of a traditional free will of an incompatibilist or libertarian kind, which Nietzsche derisively called free will in the superlative metaphysical sense, one must learn to think in new ways, to break old modes of thought and substitute new ones. Otherwise, I think such a free will is likely to appear utterly mysterious, the greatest self-contradiction conceived by the mind of man, as Nietzsche went on to argue. In what follows, I will signpost the new directions my thought had to take over the past 40 years in order to make headway on the problem. The first step was to take a new look at the so-called compatibility question. Why believe free will is incompatible with determinism in the first place, as so many thinkers and ordinary persons have believed down through the centuries? Determinist doctrines have taken many historical forms: fatalistic, theological, physical, biological, psychological, social, and so on. But they all imply that given the past at any given time and the laws governing the universe, there's only one possible future. The widespread belief that there is some sort of conflict between free will and doctrines of determinism has fueled the so-called problem of free will, from its inception. And the compatibility question has continued to be at the center of current debates about free will over the past century. Now, the first thing we should learn about these debates, I came to believe, is that if the compatibility question is formulated, as in most textbooks discussions of free will, is freedom compatible with determinism? The question's too simple and ill-formed, as one would expect of such a protean and much-used term as freedom. And many of them, the senses of freedom, that is, are compatible with determinism. Even if we lived in a determined world, we'd want to distinguish persons who are free from such things as physical restraint, addiction or neurosis, coercion, compulsion, covert control, or political oppression from persons who were not free from these things. And we should allow that these freedoms would be preferable to their opposites, even in a determined world. I think those of us who believe that free will is incompatible with determinism, we incompatibilists or libertarians about free will, should simply concede this point to our compatibilist opponents. Many kinds of freedom worth wanting are indeed compatible with determinism. What incompatibilists should insist upon instead is that there is at least one kind of freedom worth wanting that is incompatible with determinism. This significant further freedom, as I see it, is free will, which I define as the power to be the ultimate creator and sustainer of some of one's own ends or purposes. To say this further freedom is important is not to deny the importance of everyday compatibilist freedoms from coercion, compulsion, political oppression, and the like. It is only to say that human longings go beyond them. This is one shift in the direction of the compatibility question that I came to emphasize. But there's another of more importance. Most recent and past philosophical debate about the compatibility question has focused on the question of whether determinism is compatible with the condition of alternative possibilities, which I call AP for alternative possibilities. The requirement that the free agent must have had alternative possibilities and hence the power or ability to have done otherwise than he or she did. Most arguments for the incompatibility of free will and determinism, of which the so-called consequence argument of Peter van Inwagen and others is most well known, appeal to this AP condition in one way or another. These arguments claim that if determinism were true, agents could not have done otherwise, since only one alternative future would have been possible, given the past and the laws. And agents do not now have the power or ability to change either the past or the laws of nature. Compatibilist critics of such arguments have either denied that the power or ability to do otherwise, the AP condition, conflicts with determinism, or they have denied that being able to do otherwise is required for moral responsibility or free will in the first place. As I view these contentious debates, and as I've viewed them for many years, about alternative possibilities and incompatibilism, they inevitably tend to stalemate over differing interpretations of can and power, ability, and could have done otherwise. And I think there are good reasons for these stalemates having to do with the different meanings of freedom just mentioned. In response, I argue that to resolve the compatibility problem, we need to look in new directions. AP alone provides too thin a basis on which to rest the case for the incompatibility of freedom and determinism. The compatibility problem cannot be resolved by focusing on alternative possibilities alone. Fortunately, there's another place to look for reasons why free will might conflict with determinism. I have argued that in the long history of free will debate, one can find a second criterion fueling incompatibilist intuitions that's even more important than AP, though it's been comparatively neglected. I call it ultimate responsibility, or UR. The idea is this: to be ultimately responsible for an action, an agent must be responsible for anything that is a sufficient reason, condition or cause or motive, for the actions occurring. If, for example, a choice issues from and can be sufficiently explained by the agent's character and motives, together with background conditions, then to be ultimately responsible for the choice, the agent must be at least in part responsible by virtue of choices or actions voluntarily performed in the past for having the character and motives he or she now has. Compare Aristotle's claim that if a man is responsible for the wicked acts that flow from his character, he must at some time in the past have been responsible for forming the wicked character from which these acts flow. This you-are condition does not require that we could have done otherwise for every act performed of our own free will, thus partially vindicating those philosophers such as Frankfurt, Dennett, and Fisher, among others, who insist that we can be held morally responsible for many acts even when we could not have done otherwise. But the vindication is only partial, for you-are does require that we could have done otherwise with respect to some acts in our past life histories by which we formed our present characters. I call these self-forming actions, or SFAs, short. Consider Daniel Dennett's much-discussed example of Martin Luther. When finally breaking with the church at Rome, Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," famously. Suppose Luther was literally right about himself at that moment, says Dennett. Given his character and motives, he literally could not have done otherwise. Does this mean he was not morally responsible for his act? Not at all, Dennett answers. In saying "I can do no other," Luther was not disowning responsibility for his act, but taking full responsibility for it. And thus, says Dennett, could have done otherwise, or AP is not required for free will in a sense demanded by moral responsibility. So Dennett. My response is to grant that Luther could have been responsible for this act, even ultimately responsible, in the sense of you-are, though he could not have done otherwise then, and even if his act was determined. But this would be so, I would argue, to the extent that Luther was responsible for his present motives and character by virtue of earlier struggles and self-forming choices, SFAs, that brought him to this point where he could do no other. Often we act from a will already formed, but it is our own free will by virtue of the fact that we formed it by other choices or actions in the past, SFAs, for which we could have done otherwise, that is, which did satisfy AP. If this were not so, there would have been nothing we could have ever done in our entire lifetimes to make ourselves different than we are. A consequence, I believe, that is incompatible with being ultimately responsible, having you-are for what we are. So while SFAs are not the only acts in life for which we are ultimately responsible and which are done of our own free will, if none of our acts were self-forming in this way, we would not be ultimately responsible for anything we did. So if the case for incompatibility can't be made on AP alone, it can be made if you-are is added. And thus I came to believe that the too often neglected you-are criterion should be moved to center stage in free will debates. If agents must be responsible to some degree for anything that is a sufficient reason, cause or motive for their actions, an impossible infinite regress of past actions would be required unless some actions in the agent's life history, SFAs, did not have sufficient causes or motives. Lacking sufficient causes would mean that the occurrence of such actions was not inevitable, given the past and the laws of nature, and hence that the actions were not determined. Now what's noteworthy about this argument is that it does not at any point invoke alternative possibilities. It focuses rather on the sources or the grounds, the conditions, the causes, the motives of what we actually do, rather than on the power to do otherwise. Where did our characters, motives, and purposes come from? Who produced them, and who is responsible for them? Was it we ourselves who are responsible for forming them, or someone or something else, God or fate, heredity and environment, nature or upbringing, society or culture, behavioral engineers or hidden controllers? Therein, I believe, lies the core of the traditional problem of free will. Focusing on you-are also tells us something else of paramount importance about free will. It tells us why the free will issue is about the freedom of the will and not merely about freedom of action. There's been a tendency in the modern era of philosophy, beginning with Hobbes and Locke in the 17th century and coming to fruition in the 20th century, to reduce the problem of free will to a problem of freedom of action. I've been arguing for some time that such a reduction oversimplifies the problem. Free will is not just about free action, it's about self-formation, about the formation of our wills, or how we got to be the kinds of persons we are, with the characters, motives, and purposes we now have. Were we ultimately responsible to some degree for having the wills we do have, or can the sources of our wills be completely traced backwards to something over which we had no control, God, fate, physical causes, social conditioning, or the other things mentioned? But now, if one can derive or arrive at the incompatibility of free will and determinism from you are alone, one might wonder if AP is needed at all for free will. One may be tempted to think at this point that one could dispense with AP altogether. Indeed, some recent incompatibilists who are impressed by arguments of the above kinds have done just that. These narrow or uncompromising source incompatibilists, as they are called, insist that while free will is incompatible with determinism by virtue of a source or ultimacy condition, such as you are, alternative possibilities, or AP, are not needed at all for free will or moral responsibility. Now, I think this is a mistake. I'm one of the persons who started bringing in the idea of source as opposed to AP, so I was called one of the original source incompatibilists. But then these uncompromising source incompatibilists co-opted the field, and they said AP doesn't matter, or alternative possibilities don't matter. And that I felt to be wrong from the beginning. So it's like they wrote me out of their club, even though I was perhaps the first in contemporary times to emphasize this notion of source. Well, anyway, I think it's a mistake. While I'm usually regarded as one of the original source incompatibilists because of my emphasis on you are, I've never been one of these narrow or uncompromising source incompatibilists. Both conditions, I believe, you are and AP, are needed for free will. But the reasons why both are needed and the relations between them are more subtle than I think has generally been realized. This brings me to yet another way in which I came to depart from the conventional wisdom regarding the compatibility question. It's normally assumed that what incompatibilists need for free will are alternative possibilities plus indeterminism. But having alternative possibilities for one's actions, though it may be necessary for free will, is not sufficient for free will, even if the alternative possibilities should also be undetermined. One can see this by noting that there are examples in which agents may have alternative possibilities and their actions are undetermined, and yet they lack free will. I call examples of such kinds Austin-style examples, after J.L. Austin, who was one of the first philosophers to put forward examples of these kinds. Austin and others use such examples, however, for a different purpose, and did not notice that they have a significance well beyond what was originally envisaged for them. Here are three such examples. The first is Austin's own. He imagined that he must hold a 3-foot putt to win a golf match, but owing to a nervous twitch in his arm, he misses. The other two examples are mine. An assassin is trying to kill the prime minister with a high-powered rifle when, owing to a nervous twitch in his arm, he misses and kills the minister's aide instead. I'm standing in front of a coffee machine intending to press the button for coffee with cream when, owing to a brain cross, I accidentally pressed the button for coffee. I meant to do it without cream, but by a brain cross, I accidentally pressed the button for coffee with cream. In each of these cases, we can suppose, as Austin suggests, that an element of genuine chance or indeterminacy is involved. Perhaps the nervous twitches or brain crosses are brought about by undetermined quantum events in the nerve pathways. We can thus imagine that Austin's holding the putt is a genuinely undetermined event. He might miss it by chance, and in the example, does miss it by chance. Now, Austin asked the following question about his example. Can we say in such circumstances that he could have done otherwise than miss the putt? His answer is that we can indeed say this, for he had made many similar putts of this short length in the past. He had the capacity and he had the opportunity to make it. But even more important, since the outcome of his putt was genuinely undetermined, he might well have succeeded in holding it, as he was trying to do. But then this means that we have an action, missing the putt, that is, 1, undetermined, and 2, such that the agent could have done otherwise. Yet missing the putt is not something that we regard as freely done in any normal sense of the term, because it's not under the agent's voluntary control. The same is true of the assassin's missing his intended target and my accidentally pressing the wrong button on the coffee machine. One might be tempted to think now that these occurrences are not actions at all, because they are undetermined and happen by accident. But Austin rightly warns against such a conclusion. Missing the putt, he says, was clearly something he did. He missed it, even though it was not what he wanted or intended to do. Similarly, killing the aide was something the assassin did, though unintentionally. And pressing the wrong button was something I did, even if only by accident or inadvertently. The point is that many of the things we do by accident or mistake, unintentionally and inadvertently, are things we do. We may sometimes be absolved of responsibility for doing them, though not always, as in the case of the assassin. But it is for doing them that we are absolved of responsibility. And this can be true even if the accidents or mistakes are genuinely undetermined. To see what this implies about free will, consider the following scenario. Suppose God created a world in which there was a considerable amount of genuine indeterminism or chance in human affairs as well as in nature. In this world, people set out to do things, to kill prime ministers, hold putts, press buttons, thread needles, punch computer keys, scale walls, usually succeeding, but sometimes failing by mistake or accident in the Austinian manner. Now further imagine that all actions in this world, whether the agents succeed in their purposes or not, are such that their reasons, motives, and purposes for trying to act as they do are always predetermined or preset by God. Whether the assassin misses the prime minister, his intent to kill is predetermined by God. Whether Austin misses his putt, his wanting and trying to make it are preordained by God. Whether I press the button for coffee with cream, my wanting to do so because of my dislike without cream, my wanting to do so because of my dislike of cream is predetermined by God. And so it is for all persons and all actions in this imagined world. I would argue that persons in such a world lack free will, even though it's often the case that they have alternative possibilities and their actions are undetermined. This is one of the many reasons why the will cannot be taken out of the free will issue. They can do otherwise, but only in the Austinian manner, by mistake or accident, unwillingly or inadvertently. And this is a limited kind of freedom at best. What they cannot do in any sense is will otherwise, for all of their reasons, motives, and purposes have been preset by God. We may say that their wills in every situation are already set one way before they act and when they act, so that if they do otherwise, it will not be in accordance with their wills. When we wonder about whether the wills of agents are free, it is not merely whether they could have done otherwise that concerns us then, even if the doing otherwise was undetermined. What interests us is whether they could have done otherwise voluntarily or willingly, intentionally and rationally. Or to put it more generally, we are interested in whether they could have acted voluntarily, intentionally, and rationally in more than one way, rather than in only one way, and in other ways merely by accident or mistake, unintentionally, inadvertently, or irrationally. And here for the record, by voluntarily and willingly, I mean here acting in accordance with their will, namely their character plus their motives. Intentionally means knowingly, as opposed to inadvertently, and on purpose, as opposed to accidentally, and rationally means having reasons for so acting and acting for those reasons. I've called such conditions of more than one way or plural voluntariness, intentionality, and rationality plurality conditions for free will. They seem to be deeply embedded in our intuitions about free choice and action. Most of us naturally assume that freedom and responsibility would be deficient if it were always the case that we could only do otherwise by accident or mistake, unintentionally, involuntarily, or irrationally. But why do we assume this so readily? And why are these plurality conditions so deeply embedded in our intuitions? It is surprising how rarely philosophers have asked these questions, given the importance I think they have for free will. If free will involves more than alternative possibilities and indeterminism, the plurality conditions appear to be among the additional requirements. Philosophers, I came to insist, would do well to focus more attention on these conditions rather than on alternative possibilities alone. Now, to understand the importance of plurality conditions, we have to consider another neglected topic in free will debates, what I call will setting. In the imagined world of the previous section, all of the motives and purposes of agents in every situation were already preset or set one way by God. Another way to put this is to say that all the will setting in this imagined world was done by God rather than by the agents themselves, even though the agents could sometimes have done otherwise. Actions are will setting when the wills of agents, their motives and purposes, are not already set one way before they act, as the assassin's will is set on killing the prime minister, but rather the agents set their wills one way or the other in the performance of the actions themselves. Choices or decisions are will setting when they do not result from the agents merely discovering during deliberation what they already favored, but when the agents make the reasons for preferring one option prevail at the moment of choice by choosing or deciding. Will setting actions are in this sense will settling, not already will settled. The imagined world in which all the motives and purposes of agents are set one way by God provides a clue to the deep connection between will setting, UR, free will, and the plurality conditions. According to UR, if agents are to be ultimately responsible for their own wills, then if their wills are already set one way when they act, they must be responsible for their wills having been set that way. Not God, as in the imagined world, or fate, or society, or behavioral engineers, or nature, or upbringing. And this means that some of their past voluntary actions or choices must have played an indispensable role in the formation of their present purposes and motives. But it is easy to see that this requirement would lead to a vicious regress. Unless there were some choices or actions in the agent's past that were voluntarily performed, but such that the agent's wills were not already set one way when they performed them. These actions would be will setting. The agents would be faced with motivationally viable options until the moment of choice and action, and would set their wills one way or the other by choosing or acting. But then it follows that these actions would be more than one way voluntary. When the will is already set one way, as in the case of the assassin, the action is one way voluntary. The agent does otherwise only by accident or mistake, that is, unwillingly. In the case of will setting, it is voluntary either way. Will setting actions are also plural rational, since the agents make the reasons for preferring one of the options prevail by deciding or acting. And if we assume for genuine cases of will setting, as I think we should, that the agents know what they are doing and are doing it on purpose, then will setting actions will be plural intentional as well. We thus have an answer to the question of why the plurality conditions are important for free will. They follow from the requirement that if we are to be to any degree creators of our own will, some actions in our lifetimes must be will setting and not already will settled. At those moments we must be able to go in different directions willingly. And we can now finally see how AP, or alternative possibilities, gets into the picture. For we now have a sequence of connected notions. From 1, acting of one's own free will, that is, free will, to 2, being ultimately responsible for the will one has, that's UR, to 3, will setting, to 4, the plurality conditions, which is the 4th step. Each notion implies the next in this sequence, and all of them, I believe, are required to account for freedom of will as well as for freedom of action. And we can now add another notion to the sequence. For the plurality conditions, which is number 4, immediately imply 5, could have done otherwise, that is, the AP condition. Since it follows a fortiori, if you are able to do otherwise voluntarily, intentionally, and rationally, then you're able to do otherwise. But note that such an argument for AP is indirect. Unlike most philosophers who debate these issues, I think the connection between 1, free will, and 5, the power to do otherwise, is not direct. It goes through other notions, namely 2, ultimate responsibility, 3, will setting, and 4, plurality, till finally you get to alternative possibilities. You have to travel some usually neglected passages in the free will labyrinth to get from one to the other, from free will to alternative possibilities. That is why trying to go directly from free will to the requirement of alternative possibilities, or AP, which is the normal pattern, leads to unresolvable debates about whether could have done otherwise really requires the falsity of determinism, and whether free will really requires could have done otherwise. Intuitions will inevitably conflict on these matters so long as other notions such as UR, plurality conditions, and will setting are not taken into account. This reasoning leads to my final departure from conventional wisdom on the compatibility question. It appears from the above argument that AP is needed for free will after all. Yet we saw earlier that one could argue for the incompatibilism of free will and determinism from UR alone without appealing to AP. Well, this is puzzling. How are we to make sense of it? The answer, I think, lies in UR. Both 5, alternative possibilities, are AP, and 6, indeterminism, follow from UR, but by different argumentative routes. I have called this in the past the dual regress of free will. In the previous sections, we encountered 2 separate regresses associated with UR. The first regress began with the requirement that agents be responsible by virtue of past voluntary actions for anything that is a sufficient ground or reason for their actions in the sense of a sufficient cause. And this regress led to the conclusion that some actions in the life histories of agents must be undetermined, that is, they must lack sufficient causes. The second regress began with the requirement that agents be responsible for anything that is a sufficient ground or reason for their actions in the sense of a sufficient motive. And that regress led, by way of will setting and plurality, to the conclusion that some actions in the life histories of agents must be such that they could have done otherwise, that is, to AP. The first of these regresses results from the requirement, that is the one that gets us to the idea that there must not be some sufficient causes for some of our actions. The first of these regresses results from the requirement that we be the ultimate sources of our actions. The second, from the requirement that we be the ultimate sources of our wills to perform the actions. That's the one that pertains to sufficient motives. If the second requirement were not added, we might have a world in which all the will setting was done by someone or something else, something other than the agents themselves, as in the imagined world where God did all the will setting. Agents in such a world might be unhindered in the pursuit of their purposes, and their actions might sometimes be undetermined, but it would never be up to them what purposes they pursued. They would have some freedom of action, but not freedom of will. In such manner, the requirements of indeterminism and alternative possibilities have a common origin in the idea that we must be the ultimate sources or grounds of our willed actions, though the 2 requirements are arrived at by different routes. Do the 2 regresses converge? Are the undetermined actions needed to stop one regress, the ones that don't have a sufficient cause, the same actions as the will setting and plural actions needed to stop the other, which must not have a sufficient motive? The answer is yes, but the reasons for it are not trivial, and I forego the argument here for reasons of space. The arguments appear in my book, The Significance of Free Will, and I've put them in other papers as well. These undetermined will-setting actions turn out to be the self-forming actions, or SFAs, required by UR, mentioned earlier. They would be the actions in our lives by which we ultimately form our character and motives, and make ourselves into the kinds of persons we are. And they must lack both sufficient causes and sufficient motives. Although, on my view, they will have both causes and motives, just not sufficient ones in either case. Okay, so much for the compatibility question. We now turn to what I like to call the intelligibility question about free will. Can we make sense of a free will that requires ultimate responsibility of the kind described? Can we really be the ultimate designers of our own ends and purposes? Many skeptics about free will think not. They argue that being the ultimate source of one's will and actions is an incoherent and impossible ideal, since it would require us to be prime movers unmoved or uncaused causes of ourselves. The best self-contradiction conceived so far, as Friedrich Nietzsche put it. You are requires that there be some acts in our life histories that do not have sufficient causes or motives. But how could acts lacking both sufficient causes and motives be free and responsible actions? And how could such actions exist in the natural order where we humans live and exercise our freedom? These questions are versions of the so-called intelligibility question about libertarian free will. Is an incompatibilist free will requiring indeterminism and ultimate responsibility intelligible or possible at all? And can such a freedom be reconciled with modern scientific conceptions of human beings and the cosmos? The intelligibility question is related to an ancient and familiar dilemma. If free will is not compatible with determinism, it does not seem to be compatible with indeterminism either. The compatibility question is related to the first half of this dilemma, the intelligibility question to the second half. Determinism implies that given the past and laws, there's only one possible future. Indeterminism implies the opposite, same past and laws, different possible futures. But how is it possible, one might ask, that different actions or choices could arise voluntarily and intentionally from exactly the same past, barring miraculous departures from the laws of nature, without occurring merely by luck or chance? This question has had a hypnotic effect on those who think about free will. One imagines that if free choices were undetermined, then which occurs would be like spinning a wheel in one's mind, or one must pop out by chance or randomly. If, for example, a choice occurred by virtue of a quantum jump or other undetermined event in one's brain, it would seem a fluke or accident rather than a responsible choice. Such undetermined events occurring in our brains or bodies would not seem to enhance our freedom and control over our actions, but rather diminish our freedom and control, and hence our responsibility. Undetermined events are not controlled by anything, hence not controlled by the agent. The problem can be put in other ways that go even deeper. If free choices are really undetermined, that means the agents could have made different choices given exactly the same past, right up to the moment when they did choose. That is what determinism means, exactly the same past, different possible outcomes. Imagine that Jane had been deliberating about where to spend her vacation in Hawaii or Colorado, and after much thought and deliberation had decided she preferred Hawaii and chose it. If the choice was undetermined, then exactly the same deliberation, the same thought processes, the same beliefs, desires, and other motives, not a sliver of difference, that led up to Jane's favoring and choosing Hawaii over Colorado might by chance have issued in her choosing Colorado instead. That is very strange. If such a thing happened, it would seem a fluke or accident, like that quantum jump in the brain just mentioned, not a rational choice. Since Jane had come to favor Hawaii and was about to choose it when by chance she chose Colorado, she might well wonder what went wrong and perhaps consult a neurologist. Arguments of these kinds and many others like them have led down through the centuries to familiar charges that undetermined free choices, of the kinds that libertarians and incompatibilists demand, would be arbitrary or capricious or random or irrational or uncontrolled or inexplicable, mere matters of luck or chance, and hence not really free and responsible choices at all. All these terms have been thrown around in the debate. No wonder libertarians about free will, of whom I am one, of course, no wonder libertarians about free will, who believe it is incompatible with determinism, have looked around for some deus ex machina or other to solve the problem, while their opponents have cried magic or mystery. Indeterminism was required for free will, libertarians argued, but it was not enough. It might provide causal gaps in nature, but something else must fill those gaps. Some additional form of agency or causation was needed that went beyond causation in the natural order, whether deterministic or indeterministic. Thus, in response to modern science, there were numerous historical appeals in the modern era, from Descartes to Kant and beyond, to extra factors, as I like to call them, such as noumenal selves or immaterial egos, or transempirical power centers, or non-event agent causes, or uncaused causes, or whatever, to account for a traditional libertarian free will. Now, for my part, I long ago became disenchanted with all such appeals. In fact, even in that very first effort where Sellers sent me away to solve the problem, I said, I am not going to avail myself of those things. If I fail, okay, but I will not use those crutches. When I first began thinking about free will 45 years ago, the task I set myself was to see if it were possible to make sense of libertarian free will without any such traditional appeals to extra factors. That's why I guess it took 45 years. Okay. Well, way to go if one is to avoid such traditional libertarian strategies for explaining free will. I came to believe that one must take a whole new look at the indeterminist problem from the ground up. First, let us be clear that it is an empirical and scientific question whether any indeterminism is there in nature in ways that are appropriate for free will. In the brain, for example. It may very well not be there, and in any case, no purely philosophical theory can settle the matter. As the Epicureans said, if the atoms don't swerve in undetermined ways, and in the right places, there would be no room in nature for free will. I've argued for some time that the question of whether or not we have free will has an empirical dimension and cannot be settled by a priori or philosophical reasoning alone, as philosophers have often assumed it could. For example, can't be solved by introspectively appealing to experiences of deliberating or choosing, or by engaging in conceptual analysis of ordinary terms like could or power, and so on. That is one reason why the free will issue has been so philosophically intractable. And yet, philosophical reasoning is relevant to many aspects of the free will problem. And our present question is the philosophical one that has boggled people's minds for centuries, from the time of the Epicureans onward. What could one do with indeterminism, assuming it was there in nature, in the right places, to make sense of free will as something other than mere chance or randomness? The first step in addressing this question is to note that indeterminism doesn't have to be involved in all acts done of our own free wills, for which we are ultimately responsible. As I argued, not all such acts have to be undetermined, but only those by which we made ourselves into the kinds of persons we are, namely self-forming actions, or SFAs. Now, I believe these undetermined self-forming actions, or SFAs, occur at those difficult times of life when we are torn between competing visions of what we should do or become. Perhaps we are torn between doing the moral thing or acting from ambition, or between powerful present desires and long-term goals, or we are faced with difficult tasks for which we have aversions. In all such cases, we are faced with competing motivations and have to make an effort to overcome temptation to do something else we strongly want. There is a tension and uncertainty, let us imagine, in our minds about what to do at such times, that is reflected in appropriate regions of our brains by movement away from thermodynamic equilibrium. In short, a kind of stirring up of chaos in the brain that makes it sensitive to micro-indeterminacies at the neuronal level. The uncertainty and inner tension we feel at such soul-searching moments of self-formation would thus be reflected in the indeterminacy of our neural processes themselves. What is experienced internally as uncertainty would correspond physically to the opening of a window of opportunity that would temporarily screen off complete determination by influences of the past. When we do decide under such conditions of uncertainty, the outcome is not determined because of the preceding indeterminacy. And yet the outcome can be willed and hence rational and voluntary either way, owing to the fact that in such self-formation the agent's prior wills are divided by conflicting motives. Consider a businesswoman who faces such a conflict. She's on her way to an important meeting when she observes an assault taking place in an alley. An inner struggle ensues between her conscience to stop and call for help and her career ambitions, which tell her she cannot miss this meeting. She has to make an effort of will to overcome the temptation to go on. If she overcomes this temptation, it will be the result of her effort. But if she fails, it will be because she did not allow her effort to succeed. And this is due to the fact that while she willed to overcome temptation, she also willed to fail for quite different and incommensurable reasons. She is an ambitious woman, and this was an important meeting. When we, like the woman, decide in such circumstances, and the indeterminate efforts we are making become determinate choices, we make one set of competing reasons or motives prevail over the others then and there by deciding. Now, let's add a further piece to this puzzle. Just as indeterminism need not undermine rationality and voluntariness, so indeterminism in and of itself need not undermine control and responsibility. Suppose you're trying to think through a difficult problem, say a mathematical problem, and there's some indeterminism in your neural processes complicating the task, a kind of chaotic background. It would be like trying to concentrate and solve a problem, say a mathematical problem, with background noise or distraction. Whether you're going to succeed in solving the problem is uncertain and undetermined because of the distracting neural noise. Yet, if you concentrate and solve the problem nonetheless, there's reason to say you did it and are responsible for it, even though it was undetermined whether you would succeed. The indeterministic noise would have been an obstacle that you overcame by your effort. There are numerous examples supporting this point, where indeterminism functions as an obstacle to success without precluding responsibility. Included among these are the Austen-style examples mentioned earlier. Recall the assassin who's trying to shoot the prime minister, but might miss because of some undetermined events in his nervous system that lead to a wavering of his arm. If the assassin does succeed in hitting his target, despite the indeterminism, can he be held responsible? The answer is clearly yes, because he intentionally and voluntarily succeeded in doing what he was trying to do, kill the prime minister. Yet his action, killing the prime minister, was undetermined. It might have failed. Well, here's another example. A husband, while arguing with his wife, in a fit of rage, swings his arm down on her favorite glass-top table, intending to break it. A little personal experience went into this example. Again, we suppose that some indeterminism in his outgoing neural pathways makes the momentum of his arm indeterminate, so that it is genuinely undetermined whether the table will break right up to the moment when it is struck. Whether the husband breaks the table or not is undetermined, and yet he is clearly responsible if he does break it. It would be a poor excuse for him to say to his wife, "Chance did it, not me." Even though there was a chance he wouldn't break it, Chance didn't do it. He did. Now, these examples of the mathematical problem, the assassin and the husband, are not all we want, since they do not amount to genuine exercises of self-forming free will in SFAs, like the businesswoman's, where the will is divided between conflicting motives. The assassin's will is not divided between conflicting motives, as is the woman's. He wants to kill the prime minister, but he does not also want to fail. If he fails, therefore, it will be merely by chance. Yet these examples of the assassin, the husband, and the like do provide some clues. To go further, we have to add some further thoughts. Imagine in cases of inner conflict characteristic of SFAs, like the businesswoman's, that the indeterministic noise, which is providing an obstacle to her overcoming temptation, is not coming from an external source, but is coming from her own will, since she also deeply desires to do the opposite. Imagine that two crossing recurrent neural networks are involved, each influencing the other, and representing her conflicting motivations. Recurrent networks, as we know, are complex networks of interconnected neurons circulating impulses in feedback loops that are generally thought to be involved in higher level cognitive processing, and so also, I would say, in practical reasoning. The input of one of these neural networks consists in the woman's reasons for acting morally and stopping to help the victim, the input of the other, her ambitious motives for going on to her meeting. The two networks are connected so that the indeterministic noise, which is an obstacle to her making one of the choices, is coming from her desire to make the other, and vice versa. The indeterminism thus arising from a tension creating conflict in the will, as I said. In these circumstances, when either of the pathways reaches an activation threshold, which amounts to choice, it will be like you're solving the mathematical problem by overcoming the background noise produced by the other. And just as when you solve the mathematical problem by overcoming the distracting noise, one can say you did it and are responsible for it, so one can say this as well, I argue, in the present case, whichever one is chosen. The pathway through which the woman succeeds in reaching a choice threshold will have overcome the obstacle in the form of indeterministic noise generated by the other pathway. Note that under such conditions, the choices either way will not be inadvertent, accidental, capricious, or merely random, as critics of indeterminism say, because they will be willed by the agents either way, when they are made, and done for reasons either way, reasons that the agents then and there endorse. But these are the conditions usually required to say something is done on purpose, rather than accidentally, capriciously, or merely by chance. Moreover, these conditions taken together, as I have argued elsewhere, rule out each of the reasons we have for saying the agents act, but do not have control over their actions. Compulsion, coercion, constraint, inadvertence, accident, control by others, all of these can be absent from these cases. Indeed, in these cases, agents have what I call plural voluntary control over the options, in the following sense. They are able to bring about whichever of the options they will, when they will to do so, for the reasons they will to do so, on purpose rather than accidentally or by mistake, without being coerced or compelled in doing so, or willing to do so, or otherwise controlled in doing or willing to do so by any other agents or mechanisms. I show in my 1996 book that each of these conditions can be satisfied for SFAs as conceived above, even though the SFAs are undetermined. The conditions amount to satisfying the plurality conditions for SFAs discussed earlier. And they can be summed up by saying, as we sometimes do, that the agents can choose either way at will. Note also that this account of self-forming choices amounts to a kind of doubling of the mathematical problem. It is as if the agent faced with such a choice is trying or making an effort to solve two cognitive problems at once, or to complete two competing deliberative tasks at once. In our example, to make a moral choice and to make a conflicting self-interested choice, corresponding to the two competing neural networks involved. Each task is being thwarted by the indeterminism coming from the other, so it might fail. But if it succeeds, then the agents can be held responsible because, as in the case of solving the mathematical problem, they will have succeeded in doing what they were willingly trying to do. Recall the assassin and the husband. Owing to indeterminacies in their neural pathways, the assassin might miss his target, or the husband fail to break the table. But if they succeed, despite the probability of failure, they are responsible because they will have succeeded in doing what they were trying to do. And so it is, I suggest, with self-forming choices, or SFAs, except in the case of self-forming choices, whichever way the agents choose, they will have succeeded in doing what they were trying to do because they were simultaneously trying to make both choices, and one is going to succeed. Their failure to do one thing is not a mere failure, but a voluntary succeeding in doing the other. Does it make sense to talk about the agents trying to do two competing things at once in this way, or to solve two cognitive problems at once? Well, much current scientific evidence points to the fact that the brain is a parallel processor. It simultaneously processes different kinds of information relevant to tasks such as perception and recognition through different neural pathways. Such a capacity, I believe, is essential to the exercise of free will. And I've come more and more to believe that until we discovered parallel processing, one could not make sense of free will. Much as, I guess, before topology was discovered, that we couldn't solve Fermat's last theorem, something of that order. In cases of self-formation, SFAs, that is, agents are simultaneously trying to resolve plural and competing cognitive tasks. They are, as we say, of two minds, yet they are not two separate persons. They're not dissociated from either task. The businesswoman who wants to go back to help the victim is the same ambitious woman who wants to go on to her meeting. She's torn inside by different visions of who she is and what she wants to be, as we all are from time to time. But this is the kind of complexity needed for genuine self-formation and free will. And when she succeeds in doing one of the things she's trying to do, she will endorse that as her resolution of the conflict in her will, voluntarily and intentionally, not by accident or mistake. Okay. Well, such is the view of human agents as deliberators, choosers, and actors that I think would be required for the kind of free will I defend. And you might find this interesting, and yet still find it hard to shake the intuition that if choices are undetermined, they must happen merely by chance, and so must be random, capricious, uncontrolled, irrational, and all the other things charged. Such intuitions are deeply ingrained, and they give rise to a host of questions and objections that naturally arise and have been made about the view just presented. The first step in exorcising deeply ingrained intuitions about indeterminism, I think, is to question the intuitive connection in most people's minds between indeterminisms being involved in something and that something's happening merely as a matter of chance or luck. Chance and luck are terms of ordinary language that carry the connotation of its being out of my control. So using them already begs certain questions. Whereas indeterminism is really a technical term that merely precludes deterministic causation, though not causation altogether. Indeterminism is consistent with non-deterministic or probabilistic causation, where the outcome is not inevitable. It is therefore a mistake, alas, one of the oldest and most common in debates about free will, to assume that undetermined means uncaused. Libertarian freedom was often characterized in the past, about the time I began thinking about this and earlier, it was often characterized in the past as contra-causal freedom, which I think is misguided and a misnomer. Here is another source of misunderstanding. Since the outcome of the businesswoman's effort, the choice, is undetermined up to the last minute, one may have the image of her first making the effort to overcome the temptation to go on to her meeting, and then in the last instant, chance takes over and decides the issue for her. But this is misleading. One can't separate the indeterminism and the effort of will so that first the effort occurs followed by chance or luck, or vice versa. Rather, the effort is indeterminate, and the indeterminism is a property of the effort, not something separate that occurs after or before the effort. The fact that the effort has this property of being indeterminate does not make it any less the woman's effort. The complex recurrent neural network that realizes the effort in the brain is circulating impulses in feedback loops, and there's some indeterminacy in these circulating impulses. But the whole process is her effort of will, and it persists right up to the moment when the choice is made. There is no point at which the effort stops and chance takes over. She chooses as a result of the effort, even though she might have failed. Similarly, the husband breaks the table as a result of his effort, even though he might have failed because of the indeterminacy. That is why his excuse, "chance broke the table, not me," is so lame. Now, just as expressions like "she chose by chance" can mislead in such contexts, so can expressions like "she got lucky." Recall that with the assassin and the husband, one might say they got lucky in killing the prime minister and breaking the table because their actions were undetermined. Yet they were responsible. So ask yourself this question: why does the inference he got lucky, so he was not responsible, fail in the cases of the husband and the assassin, where it does fail? The first part of an answer has to do with the point made earlier, that luck, like chance, has question-begging implications in ordinary language that are not necessarily implications of indeterminism. The core meaning of he got lucky in the assassin and husband cases, which is implied by indeterminism, I suggest, is this: he succeeded despite the probability or chance of failure. And this core meaning does not imply lack of responsibility if he succeeds. Indeed, even if his possibilities of killing the prime minister were very low, if the probability was very low, he'd still be responsible if he aimed that gun and shot and he did kill him. If he got lucky had other meanings in these cases that are often associated with luck and chance in ordinary usage. For example, the outcome was not his doing, or it occurred by mere chance, or he was not responsible for it. The inference would not fail for the husband and assassin, as it clearly does. That is the inference. He got lucky, so he was not responsible. But the point is that these further meanings of luck and chance do not follow from the mere presence of indeterminism. The second reason why the inference he got lucky so he was not responsible fails for the assassin and the husband is that what they succeeded in doing was what they were trying and wanting to do all along: kill the prime minister and break the table, respectively. The third reason is that when they succeeded, their reaction was not, "Oh dear, that was a mistake, an accident, something that happened to me, not something I did." Rather, they endorsed the outcomes as something they wanted all along, and so knowingly and purposely, not by accident or mistake. But these conditions are satisfied in the businesswoman's case as well. Either way she chooses, either way. If she succeeds in choosing to return to help the victim, or in choosing to go on to her meeting, she will, 1, have succeeded despite the probability or chance of failure. 2, she will have succeeded in doing what she was trying and wanting to do all along. She wanted both outcomes very much, but for different reasons, and was trying to make those reasons prevail in both cases. And 3, when she succeeded in choosing to return to help the victim, her reaction was not, "Oh dear, that was a mistake, an accident, something that happened to me, not something I did." Rather, she endorsed the outcome as her resolution of the conflict in her will. And if she had chosen to go on to her meeting, she would have endorsed that outcome, recognizing it as her resolution of the conflict in her will. Now, another objection often made is that we are not introspectively aware of making dual efforts and performing multiple cognitive tasks in such choice situations. But I'm not claiming that agents are conscious of making dual efforts. What they are introspectively conscious of is that they are trying to decide about which of two options to choose, and that either choice is a difficult one because there are resistant motives pulling them in different directions that will have to be overcome whichever choice is made. In such introspective conditions, I am theorizing that what is actually going on underneath is a kind of parallel distributed processing in the brain that involves separate efforts or endeavorings to resolve competing cognitive tasks. This is an example of the point made earlier that introspective evidence cannot give us the whole story about free will. Stay on the surface and things are likely to appear obscure or mysterious. What is needed is a theory about what might be going on behind the scenes when we exercise free will, not merely a description of what we immediately experience. And in this regard, new scientific ideas can be a help rather than an obstacle to make sense of the subject, in this case, parallel processing in the brain. If parallel distributed processing takes place on the input side of the cognitive ledger in perception, as is now well accepted, then why not consider it also takes place on the output side in practical reasoning, choice, and action? That is what we should suppose I am suggesting if we are to make sense of libertarian free will. It has also been commonly objected that it's irrational to make efforts to do incompatible things. I concede that in most ordinary situations it is, but I contend that there are special circumstances in which it is not irrational to make competing efforts. These include circumstances in which 1, we are deliberating between competing options. 2, we intend to choose one or the other, but cannot choose both. 3, we have powerful motives for wanting to choose each of the options for different and incommensurable reasons. 4, there's a consequent resistance in our will to either choice. So that 5, if either choice is to have a chance of being made, effort will have to be made to overcome the temptation to make the other choice. And most importantly, 6, we want to give each choice a fighting chance of being made because the motives for each choice are important to us. The motives for each choice define in part what sort of person we are. The businesswoman is an ambitious woman who wants to go to a meeting, but she thinks of herself as a moral person who wants to stop to help the victim. The motives for each choice define in part what sort of person we are, and we would be taking them lightly if we did not make an effort in their behalf. But these are the conditions for SFAs. Our normal intuitions about efforts are formed in everyday situations in which our will is already set one way on doing something, where obstacles and resistance have to be overcome if we are to succeed in doing it. We want to open a door which is jammed, so we have to make an effort to open it. In such everyday situations, it would be irrational to make incompatible efforts because our wills are already set on doing what we are making an effort to do. But will-setting situations are special, and they are different, and they must be distinguished from such will-settled ones. Cognitive situations in which we are engaged in will-setting, as in SFAs, are special and different in ways mentioned in the above paragraph. In them, our wills are not already set one way on doing something, as in most everyday situations where we make efforts, which do not satisfy the above conditions. And it is a mistake to assimilate will-setting situations to such everyday situations. It has also been objected that indeterminism undermines the notion of agency by turning choices and actions into mere chance events. As noted earlier, that worry sends us scurrying around looking for extra factors other than prior events or happenings to tip the balance to one choice or the other. But there is an alternative way to think about the way that indeterminism might be involved in free choice, a way that avoids these familiar libertarian strategies and requires a transformation of perspective, one that I began to think about a number of years ago. The idea is not to think of the indeterminism involved in free choice as a cause acting on its own, but as an ingredient in a larger goal-directed or teleological process or activity in which the indeterminism functions as a hindrance or an obstacle to the attainment of the goal. If you reflect for a moment, you will see that this is the role suggested for indeterminism in the efforts preceding undetermined SFAs. These efforts are temporally extended, goal-directed activities in which indeterminism is a hindering or interfering element, like the noise or static in an electrical transmission of a message. The choices or SFAs that result from these temporally extended activities or efforts thus do not pop out of nowhere, even though they are undetermined. They are achievements of goal-directed activities of the agent that might have failed, but did not. Note that if indeterminism or chance plays this kind of interfering role in a larger process leading to choice, the indeterminism or chance need not be the cause of the choice that is actually made. This follows from a general point about probabilistic causation. A vaccination may hinder or lower the probability that I will get a certain disease, so it's causally relevant to the outcome. But if I get the disease despite it, the vaccination is not the cause of my getting the disease, though it was causally relevant because its role was to hinder that effect. The causes of my getting the disease, by contrast, are those causally relevant factors, such as the infecting virus, that significantly raise the probability of its occurrence. Similarly, in the case of the businesswoman's choice, the causes of the choice she does make, the moral choice to go back and help the victim or the ambitious choice to go on to her meeting, are those causally relevant factors that significantly raise the probability of making that choice from what it would have been if those factors had not been present. And these would be such things as her reasons and motives for making that choice rather than the other, her conscious awareness of these reasons, and her deliberative efforts to overcome the temptations to make the contrary choice. The presence of the indeterminism lowers the probability that that choice will result from these reasons, motives, and efforts, from what that probability would have been if there had been no competing motives or efforts, and hence no interfering indeterminism. since those causally relevant features of the agent which can be counted among the causes of the woman's choice are her reasons and motives, her conscious awareness, and her deliberative efforts, we can also say she is the cause of the choice. The indeterminism or chance, like the vaccination, was causally relevant to the outcome, but it was not the cause. This explains why the husband's excuse was so lame when he said, "Chance broke the table, not me," when he slammed his arm down on it. While chance was causally involved, chance was not the cause of the table's breaking. The cause was his effort to break the table by swinging his arm down on it. The chance merely made it uncertain whether the larger goal-directed activity would succeed. And so it is, I suggest, with the efforts leading to self-forming choices. These efforts, of course, are mental activities realized in the higher cognitive processing of the brain rather than in overt actions such as swinging of an arm. But the SFAs that result from these mental efforts are nonetheless also the achievements of goal-directed activities that might have failed due to chance, but did not, just as the husband's effort to break the table by swinging his arm might have failed due to chance, but did not. It is well to meditate on this. We tend to reason that if an outcome, like breaking a table or making a choice, whether overt or internal, depends on whether certain neurons fire or not, in the arm or in the brain, then the agent must be able to make those neurons fire or not, if the agent is to be responsible for the outcome. In other words, we think we have to crawl down to the place where the indeterminism originates, in the individual neurons, and make them go one way or the other. We think we have to become originators at the micro level and tip the balance that chance leaves untipped, if we and not chance are to be responsible for the outcome. And we realize, of course, we can't do that. We don't know enough about neurophysiology, for one thing, but for many other reasons. But we don't have to do that. It's the wrong place to look. We don't have to micromanage our individual neurons one by one to perform purposive actions. And we do not have such microcontrol over our neurons even when we perform ordinary actions, such as swing an arm down on a table. Okay, but let's look at another objection. Does not the presence of indeterminism or chance at least diminish the control persons have over their choices and actions? And would that not affect their responsibility? This is, in fact, another way in which objections about chance and luck have been raised often against libertarian views of free will. Diminished control. Is it not the case that the assassin's control over whether the prime minister is killed, his ability to realize his purposes or what he is trying to do, is lessened by the undetermined impulses in his arm which makes his arm waver? And so also for the husband and his breaking the table. The answer is yes, again. But the further surprising point worth noting, a point that I think is so often missed, is that diminished control in such circumstances does not entail diminished responsibility when the agents succeed in doing what they're trying to do. Ask yourself this question. Is the assassin less guilty of killing the prime minister if he did not have complete control over whether he would succeed because of the indeterminism in his neural processes? Suppose there were 3 assassins, each of whom killed a prime minister. Suppose one of them had a 50% chance of succeeding because of the indeterministic wavering of his arm. Another had an 80% chance, and a third was a young stud assassin who had a 100% chance. With this third assassin, there was no wavering at all. Is one of these assassins less guilty than the other if they all succeed? Should we say the one assassin deserves 100 years in jail, the other 80 years, and the other 50 years? No, that's absurd. Right? They are all equally guilty if they succeed. The diminished control in the assassins who had an 80% chance or a 50% chance does not translate into diminished responsibility when they succeed. Diminished control in such circumstances did not entail diminished responsibility. Imagine a lawyer for the 50% assassin arguing that his client was not guilty because the prime minister's dying as a result of what his client did was a matter of chance. Therefore, chance was the cause of the prime minister's death, not his client. not a very effective defense. There's an important further lesson here, I believe, about free will in general. We should concede that indeterminism, wherever it occurs, does diminish control over what we're trying to do, and it is a hindrance or obstacle to the realization of our purposes. But recall that in the case of the businesswoman, and SFAs, or self-forming choices generally, the indeterminism that is admittedly diminishing her control over one thing she's trying to do, the moral act of helping the victim, is coming from her own will, from her desire and effort to do the opposite, to go on to her important business meeting. And the indeterminism that is diminishing her control over the thing she's trying to do, act selfishly and go to her meeting, is coming from her desire and effort to do the opposite, to be a moral person and help the person in the alley. In each case, the indeterminism is functioning as a hindrance or obstacle to her realizing one of her purposes, a hindrance or obstacle in the form of resistance within her will, which has to be overcome by effort. If there were no such hindrance, if there were no resistance in her will, she would indeed, in a sense, have complete control over one of her options. There would be no competing motives standing in the way of her choosing it, and therefore no interfering indeterminism. But then also she would not be free to rationally and voluntarily choose the other purpose, because she would have no good competing reasons to do so. Thus, by being a hindrance to the realization of some of our purposes, indeterminism paradoxically opens up the genuine possibility of pursuing other purposes, of choosing or doing otherwise, in accordance with, rather than against our wills, voluntarily, and reasons, rationally. To be genuinely self-forming agents, creators of ourselves, to have free will, that is. There must at times in life be obstacles and hindrances in our wills of this sort that we must overcome. I say that self-formation is not a gift, but a struggle. I think libertarians about free will have traditionally tried to ignore this aspect of indeterminism. They knew indeterminism was required on their view, but assumed it could be entirely circumvented by special agencies. But hindrances and obstacles and resistance in the will are precisely what are needed for free will, which, like life itself, exists near the edge of chaos. If one were to put it in religious perspective, this fact would be related to the problem of evil. There must be hindrances and obstacles to our choices and resistance in our wills to be overcome if we are to be capable of genuine self-formation and free will. Compare Evodius' question to St. Augustine in Augustine's classic work on the free choice of the will, where Evodius asks why God gave us free will, since it brings so much conflict, struggle, and suffering into the world. Of interest also here is Kant's image, Immanuel Kant's image, which I have used before, of the bird that is upset by the resistance of the air and the wind to its flight, and so imagines that it could fly better if there were no air at all to resist it. But of course, as Kant points out, with a smile on his face, the bird would not fly better if there were no air. It would cease to fly at all. So it is with indeterminism in relation to free will. It provides resistance to our choices, but a resistance that is necessary if we are to be capable of self-formation. Now let me conclude then with one final objection. Even if one granted that persons such as the businesswoman could make genuine self-forming choices that were undetermined, isn't there something to the charge that such choices would be arbitrary? A residual arbitrariness seems to remain in all self-forming choices, since the agents cannot in principle have sufficient or conclusive prior reasons for making one option and one set of reasons prevail over the other. Indeed, if they have conclusive prior reasons, they would have already in effect made the choice. There is some truth to this objection as well. But again, I think it's a truth that tells us something important about free will. It tells us that every undetermined self-forming free choice is the initiation of what might be called a value experiment, whose justification lies in the future and is not fully explained by past reasons. In making such a choice, we say in effect, let's try this. It's not required by my past, but it is consistent with my past, and is one branching pathway in the garden of forking paths of my life that my life can now meaningfully take. Whether it's the right choice, only time will tell. Meanwhile, I'm willing to take responsibility for it one way or the other." Unquote. It's worth noting that the term arbitrary comes from the Latin arbitrium, which means judgment, as in liberum arbitrium voluntatis, free judgment of the will, which was the medieval philosopher's designation for free will. Imagine a writer in the middle of a novel. The novel's heroine faces a crisis, and the writer has not yet developed her character in sufficient detail to say exactly how she will act. The author makes a judgment about this that is not determined by the heroine's already formed past, which does not give unique direction. In this sense, the judgment, arbitrium, of how she will react is arbitrary, but not entirely so. It had input from the heroine's fictional past, and in turn gave input to her projected future. In a similar way, agents who exercise free will are both authors of and characters in their own stories all at once. By virtue of self-forming judgments of the will, arbitria voluntatis, what I call SFAs, or self-forming actions, they are arbiters of their own lives, making themselves out of a past that, if they are truly free, does not limit their future pathways to one. Suppose we were to say to such persons, "But look, you didn't have sufficient or conclusive prior reasons for choosing as you did, since you also had viable reasons for choosing the other way." They might reply, "True enough, but I did have good reasons for choosing as I did, which I'm willing to stand by and take responsibility for. If these reasons were not sufficient or conclusive reasons, that's because, like the heroine of the novel, I was not a fully formed person before I chose, and still am not, for that matter. Like the author of the novel, I am in the process of writing an unfinished story and forming an unfinished character, who in my case is myself." That's it.